Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So you guys remember 4 months ago when I said this?
The virus, okay? What's going on with the virus? Is that over? No, it's not over. It's far, far from over, guys. The next epicenter of that disaster is going to be in Africa. And something is going to emerge out of there, which is, I think it's going to be pretty serious.
The next epicenter of that disaster is going to be in Africa, in Africa, in Africa.
If you guys want to know what I think is going to happen in the next 3 to 4 months, stick around. We'll talk about it. Okay, so you know if I'm shooting videos in the car at night with the low light, then things are getting pretty serious. That's usually the case. I have to make these videos on the fly when things get really serious. I just made a video a couple weeks ago how I thought I had a bad feeling about things taking a turn for the worse. And I don't actually think that this is that per se, but this is just one more thing in the basket of collapse scenarios, which is going to befall us. So how did I predict that this thing was going to emerge in Africa? How did I predict the pandemic in the first place? How did I predict that there was going to be a situation evolving out of India back in 2020? Well, it's not because I'm some kind of clairvoyant. It's simply because I make inferences on the basis of the observation of some key elements, mostly demographical stuff. It just made perfect sense to me that if you have a population within Africa who is predominantly younger, okay, this is probably why we haven't seen this current virus take hold there in any major way. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or an immunologist or a virologist to really start to map these things out. And if you recall, I also said that masks work. And of course, the government came out a few months later and said, yeah, everybody must wear a mask. Now, if you don't wear a mask in a store, people look at you sideways. So pretty much everything we've said throughout this whole pandemic has come true. And now the whole Africa situation, which is right on cue. So what does this mean? Well, this means the following. This means that the virus has now found a way to mutate and infect younger people. And I believe what we are going to see, and again, this is just my opinion, but I have a pretty good track record of being right lately. So take it for what it's worth. This is not medical advice. Do what you and your doctor think you should do. That's all I'll say about whatever sort of intervention we're looking at. But I think in the next few months, a lot of people might not have a choice. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So my view on this whole Africa situation, and the reason why I predicted that, is because it just seemed blatantly obvious that this was the only place that was really not bothered by this virus a lot, to the same extent that everywhere else was. And perhaps that had something to do with a combination of the climate and the fact that in a lot of African countries, people are much younger because it's just a younger population. People still be having lots of babies there. India was the country I thought would initially spark some sort of mutation because of the densely populated nature of that country and the fact that it's nearly impossible to have a lockdown there. They tried that lockdown last year in 2020 and it was just kind of goofy. You know, they were beating people with sticks in the streets and everybody was cheering, yay, you know, beat these guys in the streets because they're not social distancing. And at the time I was like, you know, doesn't that seem like excessively draconian? And of course, here we are today. So the way I see it is this is definitely the one. Okay, this is the next one. This is the new Delta, essentially. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making such a big deal about it. These variants have come and gone in the past, but nothing which has spooked the markets in the way that this has. And it was interesting because the futures were down the night before significantly. So, you know, clearly big money gets this information before a lot of us do. And Brad over at Full Spectrum Survival messaged me and City and Urban Prepper at about 3 a.m. And he notified us that, hey, you know, I think this South African thing is going to kick off. And sure enough, the next morning, the markets took a deep dive. Now, do I think that this is going to be a deep descent like happened in March 2020? Right now, I don't think so, because the word on the street is that they're going to be able to tweak the jab in order to deal with this current variant in a relatively short order. Now, the way this thing is spreading, it's looking like it's probably not going to peak for a few months in the same way that the Delta peaked. If you recall, when they started talking about Delta, it really took 3 or 4 months for it to become pervasive everywhere and for it to lead to more lockdown measures within affected countries. So I see this one coming to fruition sometime early in 2022. It's not going to be rapid, but it's going to be fast because apparently it spreads pretty fast. It's 500% more infectious. So they say. Right now, we really don't know. There's not a lot of talk about whether or not it's more lethal. I think that would be the biggest point of concern. However, because this virus appears to be infecting younger people, there is possibly going to be an increased risk of more serious illness amongst young people. And of course, on the basis of that, that's where you'll see the global push for vaccination of younger and younger populations. And this is all going to coincide with the Australian implementation of the mandatory jab, which is going to happen, I believe it's in the beginning of February. So right around the time when this thing starts to take off, you're going to have the mandatory jab coming into effect. And what that all means, what sort of social turmoil that is going to create is unknown. But I don't foresee it being widely accepted with open arms if history has shown us anything in the last couple years. So do I think that this thing is going to keep crashing the markets? Probably not, unless the lethality rate appears to be much higher and unless it can really be shown to circumvent vaccines. Now, here's a thing which could potentially start to tank the markets. If the jab effectiveness, if people lose confidence in its effectiveness, because we know, and it's no mystery, it's no surprise, sure, there's not enough people talking about this, but we know that Israel has one of the most kind of controlled experiments with this whole thing. And what they've found is that their population's immunity has waned, okay, so which they've had to administer more and more booster shots. I think they're on their 4th round now. So we know that the effectiveness of these things is waning. If the consensus starts to become, and I cannot see it becoming that because we are so in the other direction right now, but if people start to become heavily critical of the effectiveness of these things, and people become resistant to the fact of what is going to be the reality, it's going to be you are going to need virtually endless boosters. It's going to be like a mandatory flu shot, essentially. We're not going to have a debate over, what is more severe and what is not severe. We know that this respiratory syndrome is relatively more severe than the flu within most populations, most demographics and ages. Whether or not we think that warrants mandatory anything, of course, is another story altogether. But that would be the only thing that I think could really spook the markets. If people start to lose confidence in it, then that could be something which could have a domino effect in the markets, potentially. I do think that this might be the final nail in the coffin for a lot of countries to start to look at mandating the jab. When that happens, it's going to be met with a lot of resistance. Part of my concern with that whole thing is that if we can mandate all this stuff, if countries can mandate, why can't the world as a whole mandate that these companies fork over the recipe so that we can eradicate any profit motive which is associated with this? And if it can become something which is not driven by free market principles, because unfortunately, right when you have the free market and the profit motive, there's an obvious conflict of interest. I mean, and we cannot just remain oblivious to the fact that there is going to be this conflict of interest when you have various organizations being sponsored by certain companies who are also manufacturing certain things that the government is saying everybody has to take there's going to be a lack of trust. It's, so they could easily resolve that by simply saying that, look, after a certain point of time, this needs to be in the public domain for use, and you can no longer exclusively profit from this. In fact, we want to eradicate all profit motive from this medical intervention so we can garner more trust with the remaining population who refuses to buy into this. Now, will there be more lockdowns? That is the question. Because of the massive push for these interventions, I don't necessarily think there will be, although there may be. We still don't know. There's always the big we don't know at this point. And honestly, we don't even know if this thing came out of Africa yet. But here's what I think is going to happen. If I could just look into a crystal ball for a second, what do I think is going to happen? I think that we're going to see this start affecting young people more. And there's probably going to be some person, some story which they follow. Maybe it's going to be a long COVID story, or the media is going to jump all over it. It's going to be like, the story of the one kid who's fighting for his life or something. And heaven forbid that happens. That would suck if that happened to anybody. But I do think at the first attempt to truly humanize the plight of young people who are going to be afflicted by this thing, I think the media is going to try to exploit some situation like this. Just don't be surprised if the nation mourns collectively for one young person who is struggling with this thing at some point. There's going to be some poster boy for it, or poster girl for the whole thing. That's what I foresee. And when, of course, that happens, that is what is going to be used as fuel. This whole thing kind of needs a Greta Thunberg. And not that I don't believe in climate change. You guys know I personally, and you don't have to agree with me, I think global warming is real. I believe the science on that. But I do think that there's going to be a Greta face put to this thing at some point in time. And because my predictions typically come months later than I anticipate, we're going to put that one probably next year, middle of next year, we'll say. And but I do think that the mandatory question, once it's implemented in Austria, and if it goes without resistance, if it goes without question, then other countries are going to try to do it. It's going to become more normalized, and that's when we're going to start to have this medical authoritarianism breathing down our necks. Now, another interesting thing with this whole story was, if you look at the cases, a lot of people are saying, oh, it's because of a jab inequity and the fact that Africa doesn't have as much access to the jab as the rest of the world, even though a lot of South Africans are just suspicious. And apparently this emerged in Botswana, or they don't really know where it emerged. It might not even be Africa. Somebody might have brought it to Africa. Who knows? But either way, they are starting to make this connection that it was the fault of the unjabbed, that's why this thing originated. But when you look at the numbers, I mean, the numbers in South Africa were down to almost nothing before this thing emerged. So it wasn't like you had these high numbers there that were triggering, that were going to provide the basis for these mutations to occur. Because the idea is that if you have a bunch of people who are unjabbed, then you're going to have greater potential, or this is the theory anyways behind it, is if you're going to have more people who have it, there's greater potential that the thing is going to mutate. But when you look at it, the last month or so, there hasn't been a lot of cases there. All of a sudden, this massive uptick. So I personally would need more data to substantiate the claim that this mutation is being brought about because more people are spreading around the virus. Because you would presume then that these mutations, if that was true, would happen at the peak of these cycles. And speaking of which, another thing I find odd is that if you look throughout 2020 or anywhere in the world where this thing has spread, before we had any medical interventions whatsoever, these things came in peaks. They came in waves. Even in 1918, before they had any medical interventions, these things come in waves. We know that the jab prevents more severe disease. But in terms of the actual waves, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of stifling with this thing. You look at the waves that came in 2020 and they went down due to social distancing, masking, hand washing, just being more vigilant around it. That was enough to quell those waves. So for me then, as a layman statistician, it's very hard for me to gauge the efficacy of this intervention that we're using here. Of course, I don't want to say the word, because you guys know why, but it's very hard to gauge how effective it is at actually slowing the spread of these waves. There's no doubt that it does prevent more severe disease from escalating. That's, pretty much undebatable, I think, at this point, for the most part, and that is reflected in the lower mortality rates post-jab era. But it doesn't appear to be slowing down the spread of the virus in itself, and there's countless examples of that. Israel is one of them, where it shows how leaky these jabs actually are in terms of the fact that you can still spread it. Now, of course, a lot of people are going to fire back and say, yes, you can still spread it, but you don't spread it as much. And perhaps that is the case, but then there's also the case that if you are jabbed, then you have this false sense of confidence that you are not going to be infecting anybody, and you're out and about more often than somebody who perhaps isn't, or who doesn't have a passport or something like that. Then if you're out 10 times as much as they are, and you're maybe only 25% as infectious, well, you're still 2 to 3 times more infectious overall than that person who is staying home because they don't have a passport. Okay. So the whole idea then that, yes, they probably do in themselves prevent or slow infection, but on the whole, because of the fact that those people who are jabbed have a free pass to go about anywhere they want, they're likely asymptomatic and spreading it. Again, this is all bro science over here, but I'll tell you what, I predicted the pandemic, I predicted the India thing, I predicted the Africa thing. Now, what else did we predict? Bitcoin we predicted the riots last year, the market crash. I'd say we got a pretty good batting percentage, guys, and the way I see it, this is going to be the final push. Now, if this thing turns out to be more lethal, and if people's confidence in the jab starts to wane, which I can't really see that happening, that could potentially lead to a major market crash. We see what's happening in Turkey. Turkey is a G20 country. I think they're still a G20 country. And they've seen a currency devaluation of 40%. Now, I don't know much about what their economic policy is there, but I'm going to have to presume it's not much different than what's happening in the United States. And everybody points fingers at these countries for fiscal mismanagement. But the thing is, the only thing that they're probably doing different from the USA is that they don't have an army that can protect the global credit card or the global reserve currency. If you have the biggest, most powerful army in the world, you can print as much money as you want and people will maintain confidence to a point. But you can print a lot more money than everybody else. So the USA printed the same amount of money as Turkey's currency has lost in the past week or so. They printed the same amount of money in the last year and a half. And we haven't seen that kind of market shock. That's because people still have confidence in the dollar. They still know that there's the guns to back it up. Okay, they still know that it's like, if you had a bunch of resources, would you want the currency from some little country of like 100,000 people who had no standing army, and that their banknotes really were irrelevant or couldn't be backed up by much more than their word? Or would you want the biggest country in the world, most powerful country, whether or not you agree on their foreign policy, you have to admit that their money is probably going to be the most secure. But of course, the tables on that are ready to turn with the whole China situation. You got the Russians on the Ukraine border, but what else is new? I mean, that's been going on for a long time, right? We just got a lot of stuff really heating up right now, and my bad feeling remains, guys. The bad feeling is still there, and it does appear that it's all just continuing to unfold. And the scary part of all this might be, and here's a final thought I'll leave you with, is that, okay, these jabs are working to some extent to prevent more infectious disease, but I heard one of the Weinsteins talking about how if this was something which leaked from somewhere, which was bred through gain-of-function research, that potentially it might have a different evolutionary course. It would not go the route of becoming less virulent, which was the case for Delta for the most part. If you were not jabbed, it was actually more deadly than the original, if I don't recall, but don't entirely quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's how it went. I don't know all the science of this, but the idea is such that if something evolves naturally, it's going to become less virulent over time. But there is a theory or a line of thinking that suggests that if it was growing in a lab, it might actually do the opposite, and it might actually evolve to become more virulent. And of course, if you have a greater viral load of something, if that's one of its mechanisms of becoming more infectious to sidestep people who are jabbed, then yes, the people who are unjabbed are going to progressively then be at greater risk of more severe disease as these variants evolve. But again, I don't know nothing. All I know is that I sure hit that one out of the park, didn't I? Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. This, of course, is one thing which could further exacerbate the problems that we're seeing in the supply chain if more places start to shut down again. I just can't imagine. The only good silver lining with all of this is a theory I made back in probably May or so, is that the imposition of lockdowns slows demand because basically people are staying home, they're not buying as much stuff, they're not using as much stuff. And if you can slow down demand, you can kind of curtail inflation a little bit. You can keep prices a bit lower if everybody's not out there trying to play musical chairs for the limited supply that remains. So the only silver lining with this lockdown may be that the average person in the masses are likely going to consume less, which could potentially ease inflation a little bit. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And what do you think is going to happen in the next 3 months? Try to keep it civil in the comment section. Your comments reflect on the channel. And of course, I have to monitor those comments because when YouTube is assessing how they're going to rank a channel in the algorithm, that is reflected in the comments. So try to keep them professional, keep your comments civil, and just state your argument without being condescending or nasty about it, and you might convince more people than otherwise. Thanks for watching, guys. Canadian Prepper out.